The title of Zia's book is Just Your Average Muslim. Well, let me tell you, I have read it and enjoyed it, and it's a far from average story about a far from average man. In this case, the word average does not imply something anodyne or mediocre, because it counterpoints other descriptions that have been applied to Muslims: militant, extremist, terrorist. But, of course, those descriptions can be applied to certain people from all faiths and of none. In Zia's context, the word average is something actually aspirational, because the book is the story of a life, of a faith, of an understanding, of a philosophy, and a journey. Has that journey been completed? Has the destination been reached? Find out for yourselves by reading this powerful, moving, enlightening, enjoyable, and immensely readable book, Just Your Average Muslim. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome its author, Zia Chaudhry.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. Firstly, for agreeing to host this evening. And secondly, for that wonderfully kind introduction. At least we know who's writing the foreword for my next book. Thank you all for taking the time to come here this evening and celebrate with me the launch of the book, although I suspect that many people are here this evening for the answer to one specific question: whether or not the photograph on the back cover of the book has been airbrushed or not. Because I've had this for a few weeks now, the jibes coming in. Oh, that's not you. You've airbrushed that. I don't want to mention any names, Ian Whitehurst, but I've had some stick for a few weeks now. So I should perhaps set the record straight. It's not airbrushed in any way. There's not been any tampering whatsoever with that image. It's just that in a certain light, from a certain angle, I happen to look perhaps less bald than I do from other angles. And if you don't believe me, you can ask the good wife who took that image. Just Your Average Muslim was inspired by my children, two of whom are here today, eating crisps like it's going out of fashion. And the youngest, you'd know about if she was here. They made me recall how, when I was young, I didn't seem to have any issue growing up as a Muslim in Britain. It wasn't particularly difficult, and I think I had it quite easy. But I got to thinking recently whether or not my children would be able to have the same painless experience, and whether or not I should perhaps assist them. Now, of course, I'd love to be around to offer guidance, but there are never any guarantees of that. So I thought maybe I should put something into writing. And that's how the project started. But almost as soon as I started it, I realized that there is a huge audience for the things I want to say in this book. Not a day goes by when Muslims aren't in the news. And arguably, aside from climate change, the most important question for society in the future is that of the path that Islam takes. Because we see many negative examples of what some Muslims do. And it might be that there's more to Islam and Muslims than what we see in the headlines. Now, of course, the book can't hope to offer definitive answers, nor can it deal with topics in as much detail as they deserve. But what it can do, and what I hope it does do, is flag up the issues that need thinking about, that need a discussion. And in exploring some of the facets of this discussion, the book really addresses two audiences, the Muslim and the non-Muslim audience. Now, for the non-Muslim reader, the book does attempt to set the record straight in some respects, to clarify some misconceptions about Muslims. Not just about the beliefs and practices of Muslims, but also things such as, do Muslims have a sense of humor? Do Muslims have common sense? Because these are things that are not readily associated, sadly, with Muslims. It might surprise some people to hear Muslims do have a sense of humor. And some even have common sense. Also, in addressing the non-Muslim reader, I've highlighted some features of Islamic history, which perhaps aren't as well known as they should be. Scientific achievements by Muslims. And we're not talking about isolated scientific achievements, a few here and there, a few notable inventions. We're talking about centuries of achievement, a period that spanned easily 500 years, if not longer, and spanned a significant portion of the world. And those achievements were not back then to be forgotten forever, but they played a role in the Renaissance that we are familiar with. But I make it clear in the book that the purpose of highlighting those achievements is not to bask in past glories. It doesn't interest me. There's a very practical benefit to highlighting those achievements, and for us all to recall those achievements. Many of you will have seen in the news today the results of the survey, BBC poll, of young people. And one of the results of it was that 1 in 4 trusted Muslims less than they trusted others. Now, I won't go into the details of the poll, how it came about. Clearly, there are many other questions that can be asked of that poll, but what it does highlight in certain quarters is a negative view of Muslims. Now, these views are never formed in isolation, never formed in a vacuum. If those same youngsters learnt at school about the centuries of Muslim achievement, maybe they could put the negative stories into some sort of context when they hear those so regularly in the news. But the practical benefits extend beyond that. We hear of young Muslims who are vulnerable to radicalization, and particularly in areas such as Birmingham, Manchester, Blackburn, Oldham, Burnley, Bradford, Leeds, areas where there are large Muslim populations. There are often schools that are sometimes 90% Muslim. Now, to me, it seems again common sense that if those Muslim youngsters were taught as part of their curriculum about Muslim achievements in science in the past, and how those achievements were not in Pakistan or India, Yemen, Africa, but were as near as Spain, and therefore were achievements in Europe, and therefore their religious ancestors contributed to this Europe that we all know. If those Muslim youngsters were taught that, wouldn't they have less chance of feeling alienated, feeling vulnerable to radicalization, feeling marginalized? Because we've seen where the alternative of marginalization and alienation can lead. A few years ago, I was in Brussels, and there the British Council had a booklet called Our Shared Europe, and it was touching on some of these themes, and it was to be used around Europe to help Muslims integrate. And I asked the British Council, acknowledge that this is a wonderful piece of literature, any reason you can think of why that shouldn't be in schools in Britain? And unfortunately, they weren't able to answer that. It all boils down to common sense again for me. But it's right to note that others have concerns about Muslims which are sometimes justified. And here the book is directed at the Muslim reader. Because in addressing these concerns, Muslims need to recall that the Quran itself commands us to speak the truth even if it be against ourselves. This means being honest and self-critical. Honest enough to acknowledge that life in 21st century Great Britain is practically heaven on earth compared to some places in the world. And we should acknowledge that and admit that. Admit that we are freer to practice our Islam in Britain than we would be in many Muslim countries in the world. Honest enough also to admit that nowhere in our religion are we granted license to be unreasonable and make unnecessary demands simply because we're Muslim. And we need to be self-critical enough to see that in some respects, at the moment, we are simply not good enough. So the book does, in part, seek to persuade, perhaps cajole, maybe even embarrass Muslims into a process of intellectual self-renewal. Now, some may regard such observations as being unduly harsh, but in private, however, I would be much more vociferous, in much the same way that when you tell your children off in front of company, you tone it down, but once you get back home, things can get a little more animated. Because the worry is that if we Muslims don't assume our intellectual responsibilities to ourselves, to our communities, and ultimately to the human race, then the type of Islam which might proliferate may serve only those who predict that a clash of civilizations is inevitable. I don't believe that it is. I think those people who hold that view are either warmongers or pessimists. The one looks forward to a fight to the bitter end, and the other is simply resigned to it. Make no mistake, it's entirely understandable that some may fear such a clash, but it can be avoided. It's just that to avoid it, a concerted mutual effort needs to be made. And no mutual effort is going to begin without a degree of understanding of the other. Yet we find that there are misunderstandings about even the basics. There are those, for example, who think that in Islam, it's only Muslims who are going to attain salvation, go to heaven. That's what Muslims believe. Now that view is forgivable if it's held by a non-Muslim, but entirely unforgivable when it's held by Muslims themselves. Chapter 2, verse 62 of the Quran says this: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, and any who believe in God and the Day of Judgment and do good deeds will get their reward with their Lord, and they have nothing to worry about. So Muslims, Jews, and Christians specifically named, but it goes on, it goes beyond that, and others who believe in God, do good deeds, and believe in accountability. So there may be people out there who don't have a particular label attached to them, but they fulfill those criteria. Well, that's how pluralistic Islam is, and yet how many Muslims know about that verse? But understanding, of course, is a two-way street. I often wonder what goes through the minds of certain sections of the media when they question the ability of Muslims to integrate into Europe, whilst ensuring that the tone of their coverage will do anything but make those Muslims feel that they're part of this society. We know which sections of the media do that. How productive is it when you'll have a negative story and it's almost as if they've got some bet on in the office as to how many times they can squeeze the word Muslim into that particular negative story. Now, I'm neither a warmonger nor a pessimist. I'm an optimist, but it's an optimism based, I would suggest, very much on realism. Because I would say that we have an historical example that we can draw inspiration from. I'm delighted to see here today my good friend Enrique Sanchez, who is a fellow lawyer, a great friend, and also the honorary consul of Spain. Aside from all that, and I could give you Enrique's CV for the next half an hour, he's also from Cordoba. Now, Cordoba is now a town, small town in Spain. 1,000 years ago, it was one of, if not the largest city in the world. 1,000 years ago, all the great minds gravitated to places like Cordoba. And some great minds emanated from Cordoba. Averroes, Ibn Rushd in Arabic. Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar, was born in Cordoba. At a time when London and Paris were dirty towns, Cordoba was described as the ornament of the world. Clean running water, street lighting, and public libraries that far exceeded the private libraries of royalty in other European countries. Cordoba was where it was happening, and it was happening with the three faiths working together. Now, Liverpool isn't Cordoba, not just yet. There is now a significant Spanish population. It is a melting pot of diversity, and it's very much, as Ken has already mentioned, a city that's on the up. Happily, we have few of the tensions between races and religions that exist in some other cities. And it's certainly my hope that it's a city that can draw inspiration from the example of Cordoba. So in conclusion, what is the vision of just your average Muslim? I'll tell you now, there's no new discovery in it. There's no reinventing the wheel, but just the simple belief that mutual cooperation leads to mutual reward. And just as in the past, others made use of knowledge that was in Muslim hands, similarly now perhaps Muslims need to make use of knowledge held by others. If my neighbors and I want to improve our street, our area, our schools, our society, and ultimately, therefore, our lives, none of that is dependent on us sharing the same faith. But having an understanding and appreciation of each other makes the tasks ahead easier, as well as life more enjoyable. As you've probably gathered by now, 10% of the proceeds of the sale of any books tonight will go to MenCap, and not to the Zia Chaudhry Hair Transplant Fund, which my wife would prefer, but it's not a charity. And on that note, I should really end by saying this, that books that are written in your spare time when you've got a busy job that can be quite demanding require sacrifices to be made. It's not me that is the one running around the three children. It's not me that does the cooking or the cleaning or keeping everything else ticking along. It's my wife. And without her efforts, I imagine this book would never have been written. Of course, she has the benefit of now being associated with an internationally acclaimed author. So my thanks go out to her as well as you all for attending this evening. So please buy the book, enjoy the book. There is a website on the back of the book through which you can contact me, and I very much would welcome your feedback as to its contents. But once again, thank you for this evening.